Welcome, Professor Peter. We are very fortunate to have you joining on this program. I'm going to keep it brief upfront to get the best out of these 12 minutes. So my first question to you is, you co-authored one of the world's bestsellers, The India Way. What are the key takeaways for emerging country like Sri Lanka?
Well, I think what was impressive about the Indian companies that we looked at, so we interviewed the CEOs of the 120 biggest companies in India. What was impressive is that, as you all know from India, they were able to do a lot without much of any help, right? We all know the joke that business prospers while the government sleeps, that government was not a big help. They didn't have a lot of infrastructure around. They didn't get a lot of support from the broader infrastructure and things. They had to do a lot of things on their own. So I think what was impressive about the way they operated was to recognize that the employees really matter. They had a social purpose. It wasn't just about making money. They took that very seriously, the idea that there was a reason we were doing what we're doing that mattered to the country, mattered to the people around us. That was, I think, quite important. They were willing to do things that were countercultural. India, of course, is a society with great hierarchy, and they were willing to cut against that, to empower workers and teams to make decisions and do things when that was the smart way to operate. Right? They persevered, and maybe this was a cultural thing about the ability to just find a way to get things done, even if it wasn't maybe the most logical way, just bang on problems until you found a way to get through them, rather than planning in a really complicated way. So we've sort of embraced this with a different label now in the US. This is the agile idea in software, right? You just get a smart team, you put them together, you get out of the way, you support them, you don't try to plan it all out. And the Indian companies were kind of doing this, I think, intuitively. And maybe this came out of a tradition of having to survive with less. I think something else, particularly for maybe particularly now for Western countries, because we're waking up to this, is to be able to take the challenges of diversity quite seriously. Your country, India, countries around you have great diversity attributes and needs. People who come from very different religions, different ethnic groups, where those things all matter a lot. And trying to find ways to get people to work together and get along, was really quite important. So I'd say overall, the big thing about Indian companies that made them really successful, and that I think we could all learn something from, is to take management quite seriously, right? It's not just about finance. None of these companies were talking about fancy deals that they cut. It wasn't really about marketing, just trying to get good at things internally, how to manage our people, especially to get them to do great things. And that's something maybe especially important to countries that don't have a lot of infrastructure around them, that don't have, lots of talented people already skilled and educated you can just throw at problems, and that don't have a government that's very supportive of business, So those, I think, were the key things.
Thank you. Based on your years of research, do national cultures and institutions influence a nation's success? What are some examples?
Yeah. So one of the things that my colleagues who study international business have been quick to point out is the notion that we are all becoming one great big homogeneous world, at least in the developed countries, is simply not true. I mean, it is true that international brands are bigger than ever, and communication with the internet is easier. That's certainly true, but it's still the case that trade across countries is not nearly as big as we think, particularly in the developed countries. People don't move quite as much as we think. We forget that around World War II and before then, there were no passports. People used to come, and that countries really matter. And because countries matter for business success, that people in the country have matters. And the obvious reason for this is if you think the culture of your business, which is incompatible with the people in it, if you were all raised in a country with a particular set of values and you want to have a culture in your business that is different from that, you're just fighting it the whole time. It's going to be quite difficult to do. So, you can see around the world, different parts of the world have different cultures, national cultures. Israel has been a very individualistic country, and even more so than the US on most of these measures. And, it's, the big Asian economic powers like Japan and Korea have been particularly good at organizational performance, companies where everyone is aligned and work hard. And if you look at, the different European countries, they have traditions and cultures that make them good at particular industries. The food industry is becoming, it has been in France. Design issues are very important in countries like Denmark, so the reason they have these competencies at least stems from their history and the culture and what your workforce was brought up with, because they bring that into the companies where they
for example, India has that in building that.
Yeah, so I think we would say that India has a kind of mixed talent pool. If you compare the two great powers in your region, China and India, right? We saw that China, of course, where the government is so important to business, made a huge push toward what we might call mid-level skills. It wasn't higher education, but it was getting everybody sort of, reasonably well, much better at getting a few people really highly educated. The best universities in India are terrific, and the graduates, compete everywhere. So India was really good at having lots of engineering talent, at least initially. The problem that India ran into at the high end now is those institutions that are great in India for education are quite small. Compared to a university engineering school, take the US, for example, the University of Illinois has 40,000 students, right? Which is bigger than all the Indian institutes of technology put together. So the problem that Indian companies had to deal with was how to get a group of people who were pretty well educated, but not in the fields where they needed them, how to get those people up to speed in fields like IT very quickly. And they have been very good at that, taking biology students and English students and history majors and turning them into IT people in the space of a few months, right? And they've done that with systematic training that is kind of mimicked a little bit on campuses what goes on in universities. So they've been really good at that, and they've spent a lot of time and money trying to do it.
I know Wharton does a lot of research. What are some of the key lessons for pandemic for HR?
Well, the issue about the pandemic, of course, is it's still going on, we're beginning to change a little bit. I'd say the big lesson that we should take away from this is in the office context seem to survive and do okay when people were working remotely. That's the big punchline. The reason for that seems to be because employers trusted their workers and gave them control over when they could work and how they could get things done, right? And this is a kind of counter to a persistent and kind of resistant trend in much of management that believes that you can't trust your workers, you have to watch them all the time. Unless you stand over them and try to make them do things, they won't get them done. And we see, even though this succeeded for most companies, we see still this lack of trust. And we see it in the form of what we call now tattleware. Tattleware is the software to try to monitor your remote workers and make sure they're always at their desk and they're always working, which defeats the purpose for being home for most people, right? Which is the ability to go talk to your kids, start them on their homework, let the dog in, get back to your office or your desk, work later if you need to in order to get things done, right? It just doesn't work, this micromanaging. I mean, we've known it for decades. It doesn't work. And yet many people in business just believe it. It is an ideology. It's not evidence-based for them. So I'd say the biggest lesson is just to remind people that you really can empower people and you really can trust them. You have to create a context where they care about what they're doing and they know there are consequences if they don't do a good job. But if you do that, they can get the work done. You don't have to micromanage them. They'll be happier. The productivity will probably be better. The quality will be better for sure. I'd say that's the biggest lesson from this.
Okay. Professor, what are the skills, industries, and services that will drive the next wave of growth post-pandemic?
I think we have struggled with that question forever. Right? The U.S. government, in particular, had been placing bets for generations. That says we will need these skills in a few years. We will need, and it's always proved wrong. So it is very difficult, to say what those skills will be. Even if you say something like, IT skills are important. The problem there is even though IT becomes more important, it also can do things with IT and computer systems that it would have taken sophisticated programmers. So, using IT isn't necessarily the same thing as needing IT skills. So I think that one's kind of a myth. I think if my best guess as to what the future looks like is that it will look like the past, only more so. And that is trends that have been underway for a while are the big ones. And they're the ones that are likely to matter. Occasionally, there are things that really shake us out of our direction, like the pandemic, like the global recession, the Great Recession in 2009, completely unpredictable. It's difficult to imagine how you would prepare or try to anticipate those things. So the things that have been underway for a while in the workforce are, the ability to manage people becomes more important, I think. We understand that interpersonal skills really matter. We've always known that, but a lot of this is just working its way down to the average employer, let's say. We've always known those things matter a lot. Being able to solve problems on your own seems to be working better. The move away from bureaucracy toward teams, those things are probably going to continue. So if you wanted to bet on something, I would bet on those changes which are already underway. They're likely to continue for a while.
Professor, I know you do a lot of research on leadership. What are the key lessons for national leaders and company leaders from this pandemic?
Well, I can't say I'm actually a leadership expert. I appreciate the suggestion that I might be, but I have looked a lot at the pandemic, and I think, in the context of the current pandemic, particularly when people are out of an office, the leaders have to do a lot more communicating, right? A lot more explaining what's going on. Whenever there's uncertainty, the problem is employees want to know what's going on. And if you don't tell them, they will make up an answer. And so at the very least, we have to tell them, we don't know yet. For example, when will the pandemic lift? When will we be able to come back to the office? If you don't know, you should tell them, we don't know yet. Here are the things we're looking at in order to see. Because if you don't tell them that, they will assume you know. More communication on where you're headed. If you want people to come back to the office after having been working at home, you have to explain why. Well, you have to give them a good reason as to why, right? So I think we need more communication. I think at the supervisory level, one of the things that we have learned, I think many companies learned during the pandemic, was the importance of having supervisors at least check in with their employees once a week or so, each employee, just to say, how are things going, right? Are there problems with your work? and finishing your projects. Let's talk about the work. In the office, we often ignore that. You see me every day, so you don't think we have to really talk about work, because you say we talk all the time. But we're talking about cricket, or we're talking about food, or we're talking about our families. We're not talking about my projects, what's getting in the way of what I'm doing. And I don't think you can rely on the employees just to raise their hand and say, I have a problem, particularly if we're never talking about work and you don't know much about what I'm doing. If I raise my hand and say, I've got a problem, it makes me look bad, because all you know is, oh, Peter has problems, right? So that's something which has always been important. It became more critical during the pandemic for office workers who were working from home, because you couldn't easily find these things out.
Okay. My final question is in two parts. My first question is, what will the world look like in 10 years, and what really keeps you up at night?
Yeah. I guess, again, my sense about predictions is I'm no good at making them. So you just look at how things are looking now and what the changes have been. They'll probably continue on. One of the things that surprises a lot of people who always believe that we're in the middle of this extraordinary change is to say, if your parents or grandparents came back to your house today, what would surprise them? And depending what country you're in, the answer could be quite different. But if my grandparents had come, but would be quite old now, 100 years or so, at least, if they came back to my house now, I don't think much of anything would have surprised them, honestly. We have stoves, we have in the kitchens, we have sinks, we have a dishwasher. It's not that radical an idea, really. Things are not quite as different as we might imagine on the technology side in particular. The bigger changes have been on the social side, right? And a lot of the changes that really have mattered are in the way we manage people. And frankly, at least in the West, in the US in particular, they're worse for people, more stress on individuals, that sort of thing. So, and the biggest changes actually tend to be social rather than technology.
And what really keeps you up at night?
Whether my kids are going to get jobs and make it in the world, right? I mean, it is so much more difficult, at least in the US now, to get into the labor force, to get a career. You're so much more on your own. You're not getting help much from employers. And I think for this next generation, it's been true for probably 20 years or so, but it's a big worry that people at the very top, they're doing fine. But the people below that, it's hard. It's really hard. It's really uncertain. And they need a lot of support, which typically they're not getting.
Are you working on any new books?
I just wrote a book, came out this month called The Future of the Office, which is a book about working from home and basically just thinking through how complicated all those decisions are if you decide as an employer to allow people to keep working from home, and what kind of accommodations do you have to make for this? What are the fairness issues around who works from home and who doesn't, et cetera? It's a really complicated story. And the other book that I am finishing is a book about how human resources really looks and really operates, at least in the US. It is so different from the textbooks, Just briefly, if you think about a textbook describes how people get hired, we craft the job description, we post job ads, we get applicants. Actually got a job in the US the past couple of years or so, report they were never even looking for a job. Somebody came and got them, right? So we have these kind of textbook descriptions of how things work, and they're quite unrelated to the contemporary reality. The book is just outlining what does this model really look like now, and does it make any sense or not?
So thank you very much for taking time out to talk to us. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to rereading your book, The India Way.
Good.
I was looking for it in my library. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Good. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.